Coming up next on the Connecticut Network. Accusations of bias in the news media seem to go hand in hand with politics and elections nowadays. But are they really anything new? I'm Diane Smith. Join me at Connecticut's Old State House for the final installment of Taking Sides, the role of partisanship in politics and policy.
I'm Sally Whipple. I am lucky enough to be the Director of Education at Connecticut's Old State House, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here today. The Old State House is just about the only building on earth, and it may be the only building on earth, where you can see Mark Twain's bicycle, a giant original portrait of George Washington done by Gilbert Stuart, and a two-headed calf. There are not too many places where you can do that, but we have that here. And we also have a lot of other rich stories here. This building has a very rich history, and we've been adding to that history with our monthly free lectures that focus on Connecticut citizens and the changes that they have affected in our state over time. We like to bring these citizens to life for you, or bring some of the stories of Connecticut's past to you. And we do that through stories presented by historians usually, and through lively panel discussions led by Diane Smith. We plan to follow future programs with opportunities for you to explore ideas and issues further through small group conversation. Some of you at other lectures have expressed an interest in helping us think through how to do this, and we'll be contacting you very shortly for your help. And speaking of help, a program like this depends on a lot of people for their help and support, and we certainly get a lot of that here at the Old State House. I would first like to thank the Connecticut Humanities Council for funding this program, and I would also like to thank the staff and board of the Connecticut Humanities Council for the support that they give to Connecticut's Old State House and to scores of humanities organizations and heritage organizations across the state. Because of the Humanities Council, you have probably seen some fantastic exhibits and gone to some wonderful programs in Connecticut, and so we all need to be mindful of the great work that they do. I would also like to thank CTN for recording this program for TV broadcast and online consumption. Because of them, these programs are able to be seen by people across the state who wouldn't otherwise be able to come here on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon. The Connecticut Network is the citizen source for complete and balanced coverage of Connecticut state government and public policy. And as a Connecticut citizen, you should definitely bookmark their website so that you can check in on what's going on at our government and to see what other citizens throughout the state are doing. This program and others like it also air on CTN and can be seen on the website, so it's a good thing to know about. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Rebecca Tabor-Conover, who is a master at turning ideas and concepts into programs like this. She's done a wonderful job on this program and many others as well. And I'd like to thank Diane Smith, who is going to introduce our speaker and moderate our panel today. So please join me in welcoming Diane and all of our speakers today.
Hello, everybody. I'm really glad you're here, and I'm glad that you were able to make time for us. Before we start, I should say that this all stuff is temporary, the footcast and the armcast. It happened on primary night. In my other life, I'm the elections coordinator for CTN, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we were getting ready to do live broadcasting at 7 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, I decided before I head downtown, I better take the dog for a quick walk. And that was my undoing. I tripped over my dog, and I ended up breaking my elbow, getting a huge whack on the head with a big black eye and an ostrich-shaped egg, and I broke my foot. Nevertheless, at 7 o'clock that night, we were on the air live, and we stayed on the air live until 12:30. So. And we'll be live again on election night, only this time I'm being wrapped in bubble wrap for the couple of days before to make sure nothing happens, so I hope you'll tune in. But it's great to have you all here. This has been a really interesting lecture series, taking a look at all different ways that partisanship has affected politics. And we've had some politicians here, we've had some people outside of politics, and what we've tried to do in this series is to connect things that happened in the Old State House and in the time that this was the seat of the government to things that are happening today. So here's where we're going with this. We're starting out with a look at media and how partisanship in the media affects politics and affects elections. Here are some of the words that you hear every day. Fair and balanced. We report, you decide. All the news that's fit to print. Liberal media, mainstream media, drive-by media, America's anchorman, all terms that we hear about news coverage, but which to believe. Fox viewers say that the news on that network is the only reporting that's fair and balanced, but is that true? Or do they think it's fair and balanced because of a marketing slogan that says fair and balanced? And you hear that enough times as you're watching TV and you start to think they must be fair and balanced. And of course today there are so many sources of news. I think most of us grew up probably watching the evening news, maybe reading one of our local papers, and maybe also occasionally looking at a national paper like the Times or the Post or the Wall Street Journal. These days we are inundated 24 hours a day with all sorts of sources of news and commentary. And how do you draw the difference? Coming from all viewpoints. And as people in journalism would say, coming from many different viewpoints and unvetted. That is the kind of news that we've grown accustomed to in our time, where there were fact checkers and editors and producers who checked what the material was and the content was before it hit the printed page, before it went out on the radio or on television. These days, when you get your news from the internet, that's not happening, at least in many cases. So probably everybody in a seat here today would accuse a portion of the media of being biased. And that's usually the portion that disagrees with our point of view, right? They're the biased side. And I wanted to read you this, a little piece that came off Salon.com recently that said, just because a news source is biased, it does not mean it's wrong about everything. Secondly, there is no such thing as an unbiased news report. Thirdly, in the internet age, people can seek out whatever spin they want to support their own political views. And finally, the writer said, it is insulting and it is arrogant to assume that everybody who disagrees with you is somehow less reasonable and more susceptible to brainwashing than you are. But are these charges of bias in the media anything new? And how does media bias affect elections? Where do you draw the line between news and commentary? How do you even tell which is which? Those are some of the questions that we're here today to explore in this latest edition of our lunchtime lecture series. And here to give us some historical perspective is our speaker, Paul Janisch. Paul was a newspaper reporter and editor for more than 30 years and is a professor emeritus of journalism at Quinnipiac University, where he still teaches a senior seminar. In fact, Paul is the person credited with creating the graduate journalism program at QU. He was the first print journalist to join the faculty full-time. He was the chief editor, among many other positions, of the Courier-Journal in Louisville, the Rockland County Journal-News, which I grew up reading and my parents still read, and the Telegram and Gazette in Worcester, Mass. He was a newspaper consultant in Russia and has lectured in China. And this morning, when I was reminding some folks at the Hartford Courant that they ought to come to the lecture today, a couple of them emailed me back and said, we're going to try to be there because we're Paul Janisch groupies. So here he is, Paul Janisch.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, friends. It's very appropriate to be here to talk about the news media. Did you know that Thomas Jefferson hated the Connecticut Courant, precursor of our own Hartford Courant, because he said the newspaper engaged in vicious attacks on his character? Journalists love this Jefferson quote: "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate to prefer the latter." But 20 years later, Jefferson said this: "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put in that polluted vehicle." Journalists never refer to that quote. In spite of the often rabid attacks by newspapers on their honesty and probity, the Founding Fathers believed in freedom of the press and guaranteed it in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Jefferson had good reason to be upset with the pro-federalist Connecticut Courant. It predicted that under his presidency, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will openly be taught and practiced. Incest. And politicians in this modern era think the media are hard on them. On his 250th birthday in 1993, the Hartford Courant got around to apologizing to Jefferson. Bias in our media, real or perceived, is nothing new. It didn't start with Murdoch. It goes back to our colonial days. It's still common in the media of other countries. I hope to provide a historical perspective on bias in our media. We will travel from the age of the partisan press through the age of press barons and the age of corporate owners to the dawn of the age of the me media. The term media, of course, once applied only to newspapers. Early newspapers were not impartial. They reflected the partiality of the person who put them out, usually the Crown or a printer whose main business was job printing, not publishing a newspaper. The first colonial newspaper was Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. This was in 1690 in Boston. After just one issue, it was suppressed because it was published without the approval of the governor of Massachusetts, as was required. In the 1730s, the New York Weekly Journal published assaults on the governor of New York. The printer John Peter Zenger was arrested for seditious libel. His lawyer argued that truth is a defense against libel, and Zenger was acquitted. You can see that even in colonial times, the press was at odds with the powers that be. During the American Revolution, John Adams saw newspapers as essential to the Patriots' cause. He said he knew of no means of information more sacred than a free press. This role of newspapers as an instrument of partisanship carried over into the early years of the Republic and beyond. Then it was federalism versus republicanism, Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson. It was the age of the partisan press, when newspapers were tied to political parties. The Republican press attacked George Washington as despot, dictator, and tyrant. The Federalist press denounced Jefferson as immoral. The Connecticut Courant's diatribe is just one example. A scandalmonger of that time, James Callender, accused Jefferson of keeping a slave, Sally Hemings, as his mistress. The charge was disregarded by most historians until, a couple of decades ago, DNA tests of Sally Hemings's descendants proved it was true. As president, John Adams thought the press had become so destructive that he and the Federalists pushed the Sedition Act through Congress, making it a crime to attack the government or the president with false, scandalous, or malicious statements. Talk about a clash between media and government. Some 25 journalists, mostly pro-Republican, were convicted. The public outcry helped elect Jefferson president in 1800, and the act was later repealed. The age of the partisan press morphed into the age of press barons. In the 1830s, Benjamin Day started the New York Sun. It cost 1 cent, the first of the penny press newspapers. The Sun marked the beginning of popular journalism, which reached out to readers across party and class lines and was livelier and less pedantic. Selling more papers attracted more advertising. Newspapers became successful businesses. Patrons were not as necessary, such as political parties. But proprietors still picked their causes and candidates and sometimes ran for office. Horace Greeley, the proprietor of the New York Tribune, was a reformer and against slavery. He promoted the new Republican Party. He campaigned against President Grant for the Republican Party nomination and lost. James Gordon Bennett was proprietor of the New York Herald, the first modern newspaper. Seeking a mass market, the Herald covered finance, sports, the theater, and police court, and had a core of European correspondents. Bennett was partisan but fickle and never tied himself to one cause or one politician. No issue so divided the press or the country as much as slavery. Most, but not all, newspapers in the North opposed it. Most, but not all, newspapers in the South supported it. During the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln accused newspapers in the border states of bias in favor of the Confederacy and ordered many of them closed. In the late 1800s, Joseph Pulitzer acquired the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the New York World. He became a leading figure in the Democratic Party, crusading against big business and corruption. William Randolph Hearst, a familiar name, started with the San Francisco Examiner and acquired the New York Journal, engaging in a bitter circulation war with Pulitzer's World. Both practiced sensationalism. Hearst created a chain of nearly 30 newspapers, expanding to magazines. He was twice elected as a Democrat to the U.S. House, but was unsuccessful as a candidate for governor and lieutenant governor of New York. He dictated editorial page positions to all his newspapers and even told them what news to cover or not cover. Pulitzer must have had a guilty conscience. He provided funds to start the Columbia University School of Journalism and established the Pulitzer Prizes for Excellence in Journalism. Both were meant to elevate journalism to a professional level. And this leads us to objectivity. The idea of separating news and opinion flowered in the early 1900s. It was thought that to be successful, a newspaper had to appeal to potential readers of all political persuasions. So, objectivity was not a moral imperative so much as a sound business practice. In reality, bias remained rampant in international reporting for and against intervention in the Great War, or World War I as we call it today, and at home in covering social issues such as race, women's suffrage, and prohibition, and in politics too. William Jennings Bryan encountered so much newspaper opposition in 1896 that he decided to go around the media. Sound familiar? For the first time, a candidate for president actively campaigned in personal appearances. Didn't do him any good. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a master of going around or through the media to reach the public. He went around the media by delivering fireside chats directly to the public over the radio. More about radio in a minute. He went through the media by treating the working press, that is, reporters and photographers, as his buddies. He got beat up on the editorial pages, but usually was treated heroically in the news columns. And he was elected president 4 times. The most prominent magazine baron of the 20th century was Henry Luce. He co-founded Time magazine, the first news weekly, and started Fortune, Life, and Sports Illustrated. Time, Life, and Fortune mirrored his Republican leanings, Eastern establishment Republican leanings, that is. He was pro-business and pro-nationalist China. He never portrayed his magazines as being objective. Now we come to radio. The two pioneers of developing the medium were David Sarnoff of NBC and William S. Paley of CBS. Both weren't really barons, but businessmen. They didn't try to impose their views on their audiences. But there were individuals who used radio as a megaphone for their causes. The most prominent was Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest in a suburb of Detroit. In the 1930s, Coughlin reached 40 million listeners every week with his radio program. He first supported FDR, then turned against the New Deal and praised Mussolini and Hitler, and became venomously anti-Semitic. For the 1936 election, Coughlin and others formed the Union Party. Don't hear much about this anymore, which attracted support from both ends of the political spectrum, both right and left. They ran a lackluster candidate for president in 1936, William Lemke, congressman from North Dakota. He lost and got only 2% of the vote. Does this show that even a popular media voice such as Father Coughlin's cannot influence an election? Or would the Union Party have done much better with a more appealing candidate? CBS played second fiddle to NBC until the run-up to World War II, when Edward R. Murrow started building an all-star news team of foreign correspondents. Murrow and his boys, as they were called, although it included one woman, had a point of view, pro-Britain and anti-Hitler's Germany. Some listeners objected. But after the U.S. entered the war, all our media were pro-Allies, and no one objected to that. After the war, Murrow headed CBS News, but his friendship with Paley unraveled in the 1950s over the hard-hitting tone of Murrow's TV showcase, See It Now. Alcoa dropped its sponsorship of See It Now over programs about Senator Joseph McCarthy. Paley was upset about losing revenue. Embittered, Murrow left CBS. Did Murrow editorialize? Yes. Those who agreed with him applauded his courage. Those who didn't agree with him were glad to see him go. Paley was adamantly opposed to editorializing in CBS News programs. Was he being responsible? Or was he being gutless? The age of press barons morphed into the age of corporate owners. Local owners of newspapers and of radio and TV stations sold out to large chains with shares traded on Wall Street. The management of a media corporation was interested in bottom-line results and boosting the stock price, but not in advocating causes. And a good example is the Gannett Company, for which I worked for a while. It's the country's largest newspaper publishing company. It puts out USA Today and some 100 local newspapers. Now, Hearst, as you may know, told his newspapers whom to endorse. Gannett doesn't care. Local publishers have free rein to endorse candidates or causes or oppose candidates or causes. In fact, USA Today has an opinion page which does not endorse candidates at all. Codes of ethics were adopted by organizations of newspaper and radio TV journalists and individual media companies as well. These codes of ethics say that a line should be drawn between news and opinion, and that opinion should be clearly labeled as such. In the post-war era, media bias was not much of an issue. Our government, our society, and our media were anti-communist. On the home front, most Americans, including those in the media, were in the middle of the road. But then, what I call the conservative objection surfaced. It started gaining steam in the 1960s. Conservatives thought the media were devoting too much attention to civil rights, to women's rights, and later to protests against the war in Vietnam. Conservatives saw the 3 TV networks and most of the major newspapers and the news magazines as engaged in a conspiracy of the, quote, media elite, end of quote, to present a liberal view of events and trends. Richard Nixon thought the media looked down on him and were enchanted with John F. Kennedy. Nixon lost in 1960. Then he lost the race for California governor. Remember what he said was my last press conference? At the press conference, he blamed the media for his defeat. At the 1964 Republican National Convention, Dwight Eisenhower urged the delegates to scorn the divisive efforts of sensation-seeking columnists and commentators. Delegates cheered and shook their fists at the TV booths. They felt the media had been favoring Nelson Rockefeller and William Scranton over Barry Goldwater in the campaign for nomination for president. After Nixon was elected president in 1968, he declared war on the media. Prominent journalists were put on his enemies list. Vice President Spiro Agnew, remember this, called journalists nattering nabobs of negativism and an effete corps of impudent snobs. Attorney General John Mitchell threatened to have broadcast licenses taken away from Washington Post television stations because of its unrelenting coverage of Watergate. Were the media biased against Nixon? His supporters said yes. Most people in the media said journalists were just doing their jobs. In any case, the Nixon legacy of campaigning against the so-called elite liberal media lives on. Now our brief history is approaching the current era, in which there are two major developments relevant to the theme of media bias. They are talk radio and cable news. Talk radio flourished after the FCC dropped the Fairness Doctrine, which required holders of broadcast licenses to present all sides of an issue, not just one side. With no Fairness Doctrine, a station can air commentary all the time without providing any opposing views. And so an estimated 90% of talk radio is conservative. Why are there so few liberal commentators on talk radio? Most radio stations are owned by one of only 3 or 4 big companies. There are some markets where every radio station is owned by the same company, AM, FM, 6, 8 stations. The number of stations one company can own was raised at the same time the Fairness Doctrine was eliminated, both in the name of deregulation. The management of these huge radio groups say liberal talk doesn't attract enough listeners. Liberal critics say the radio groups are pushing a conservative agenda. This brings us to cable news. CNN, the first all-news cable channel, claims to be unbiased. Many conservatives disagree. The Fox News channel is like talk radio with pictures. It is a platform for conservatives. Rupert Murdoch, whose News Corporation started the channel, hired Roger Ailes to run it. Ailes never was a journalist. He was a media advisor to Richard Nixon and other Republicans. The brief Fox News recaps may be unbiased, but all its programs star conservatives, such as Glenn Beck, Bill O'Reilly, and Sean Hannity. MSNBC has commentators who are unabashedly liberal, namely Keith Olbermann and Rachel Maddow. But liberals don't have as much camera time on MSNBC as conservatives have on Fox. Now we come to the internet, which has everything. Unbiased material, biased material, and just plain junk. On it you can find a wide range of content from reputable sites maintained by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to the ravings of lunatics. Many say there is a great degree of bias in the media today, but they disagree on its direction. Liberals point to talk radio and to the Fox News channel as examples of conservative bias. Conservatives point to what they see as liberal bias in major newspapers and the traditional broadcast networks. Most journalists would say bias is in the eye of the beholder, and they would say that news covered by the so-called mainstream media is mostly nonpartisan. I wonder about the future. Are we morphing into a new age of me media? In the age of me media, you can have a blog and be your own press baron. And if you so choose, you can look only at information that reinforces your prejudices. How do I feel about the age of me media? During the discussion that will follow, you can ask me, and I'll tell you. Thank you.
Hi, while our panelists are getting set up, I'd like to tell you about the next program that we'll have in this series. It's actually going to be a little different than what we normally do. Next October 13th, we're inviting you to a play, an original play that we are presenting along with the National Theater of the Deaf. And the play will be about the citizens and legislators at the Old State House and the governor at the Old State House who helped to bring about the American School for the Deaf and helped bring sign language to America. The performance will be in this room at 12 o'clock on October 13th, and it will be done in spoken word and American Sign Language. So it's for everybody, and it will be a very interesting program that will really highlight an important role that this building played in deaf culture and deaf history, as well as Connecticut history. Thank you. Diane?
All right, well, thank you very much, Sally. And we're glad you're here because we'd like you to ask questions. Please just raise a hand if you have a question that you want to ask, and I'll repeat the question, and we'll have our panelists answer it for you. So this will be airing on CTN, so we'll be able to see you. Now, you seem a little concerned, ma'am, the woman in the first row. You're a little concerned about the risers? Okay.
Go on.
I should say we normally have wider risers than this, but somehow these more slender ones came to us today. Okay, so here we are, the elite core of nattering nabobs of negativism. And it's
Impudent
good
snobs, too.
Impudent snobs, that's mostly Scully. But I want to introduce you to our other panelists today. Seated in the middle is Rich Hanley. Now, Rich has taught at Quinnipiac's School of Journalism since 2001, and that follows a 23-year career as a journalist. He is presently an assistant professor of journalism, and he directs the graduate journalism program. Hanley is a frequent contributor of opinion pieces in national and global media and has appeared on national news programs on both sides of the spectrum, both MSNBC and on Fox News, including The O'Reilly Factor. He's a panelist on the weekly show that you hear with Faith Middleton on WNPR, the political discussion program Politics, Burgers, and Beer. And he is somebody that I have relied on for a long time to try to explain to me what exactly is the world of new media versus what I have heard Rich call legacy media. So we'll get into those terms in a moment. In spite of his boyish good looks, Patrick Scully has worked in communications for more than 24 years. He is currently a communications consultant for Scully Communications. His career highlights include working for Sullivan Lashane Public Relations as a public relations associate. He was also the director of communications and media for Senate Democrats in Connecticut's General Assembly, which is when Patrick and I started our email correspondence that would start at 4:30 every morning, because he'd wait to hear what Ray and I were going to talk about, and then he'd have comments, and he would be sending us people to speak out about those. He has also been the director of the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights and the director of public affairs programming for Yale University. Pat also writes a daily blog that is read by most of the people involved in politics in the state of Connecticut, and he calls it The Hanging Shad. So I advise you to look for it. Rich, let's put this in a little bit of historical perspective for a moment, since I said that you're the person who explains new media to me. How does today's contemporary media compare with historical forms of news gathering and news passage, such as the coffee houses, the taverns, the town square where people used to gather?
Right. The emerging technologies have made news more ephemeral and more ubiquitous than ever before. I mean, in my pocket I have a cell phone, which is actually a computer, and more consumers are consuming news, grazing on news throughout the day. And that means news media companies, be it just one person or huge conglomerates, have to keep feeding it. And what works well in the technological sphere is stuff that captures people's attention. There is Lady Gaga dressing in a meat dress has this very specific purpose. Those of you who don't know, she, at the Video Music Awards, wore a dress made out of meat. And the reason she did that was to rise above the clutter of discourse that the internet and other technologies has created. And what in the political sphere, or public sphere, as the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas would identify it as, what's happened is anger and sharply pointed opinions are the devices to have your argument or your statements get above the ephemeral clutter of the day-to-day noise. So in engineering terms, the signal-to-noise ratio, right now is very pronounced because of the proliferation of technologies, distribution systems, and the sheer ubiquity of it.
And speaking about talk media, which Paul Janisch was talking about a little while ago, about radio and conservative radio talk, the big news in town today, if you haven't heard it, is that Governor John Rowland has been hired to host the afternoon show on WTIC radio, which formerly was a bastion of objective reporting and I would say pretty middle-of-the-road kind of commentary among the talk show hosts for much of its more than 60-year history. And now the governor will be hosting the afternoons along with a host of other conservative commentators. And I guess, Pat, what that brings me to is, where do we draw the line, or is there a line anymore between news and commentary?
Well, not to sound like President Clinton and saying what the definition of is. It really is about what your definition of the media is. If you take collectively the commentators, the talk show hosts, both radio and TV, and the journalists, and put them all into one mix, it is weighted heavily towards the conservative viewpoint, in my view. That may be because that's what gets ratings. Nonetheless, that's where we are. And it's those folks that are the commentators and the talk show hosts that want it both ways. If you criticize what they have to say, they pull back and say, hey, I'm a commentator, I'm not a journalist. Yet Rush Limbaugh calls himself America's anchorman, a phrase you pointed out at the beginning. Sean Hannity opens his radio show by saying his show provides the most inclusive and complete election coverage. So they're trying to muddy the line between the two, except when they get criticized and it works for them. And then by the same token, Glenn Beck, our own morning zoo host on radio in New Haven when he started, he put together a rally in Washington on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech and was the top guest on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace the next day. There is no better example of the muddling. Chris Wallace, supposed to be an objective, down-the-line journalist, has Glenn Beck, who once called President Obama a racist. He was the number one. So we're having a complete blurring of the line between the two, and I think that's unfortunate.
Paul, as somebody who comes from a long tradition of newspaper, some people have said that newspapers used to really mark where the commentary was because they had an editorial page, they had an op-ed page, they had columnists. As newspapers have changed and a lot of people would say declined, how has that led to that blurring of the line now?
Well, actually, newspapers, the traditional format for a newspaper, which is print on paper and dropped in your driveway or in your rose bushes, it still adheres to that model. Now, one can say adheres to it imperfectly because there are many newspaper readers who think that, well, yeah, they're supposed to confine editorials to the editorial page and the news columns is for straight news, but actually I think this newspaper is slanting the news one way or another. But at least that's the ideal, that's the model, and that still is the case with newspapers. But as you point out, newspapers are in decline right now. It's interesting to me that newspaper websites, which have all of the content that you find in the traditional newspaper, have added blogs, that is weblogs, I hate that term, but that's very common now, by staff, and they express opinions, but they also encourage users, the members of the public, to contribute their opinions about the news of the day and so on. And so there's a mix, and somebody who's maintaining one of these sites could say, well, we make it very clear, you know, this is the news and these are comments from our people or from members of the public, but I don't know if people who look at the site really draw that distinction.
Something interesting about that, too, is that people can add their comments to a blog without having to fully identify themselves, whereas people in this audience who have written letters to the editor know that they contact you, they want to make sure that you really are the person you said you are, they double-check your address, your phone number, and everything else before they even publish a letter to the editor.
You're quite right, and I find that deplorable. I was, as you mentioned, I was the top editor of 3 newspapers, which were quite different in size and mission and an editorial point of view, as a matter of fact, but all of them under my administration, but under people before me and after me, letters to the editor had to be signed, and when they were received, they had to have an address and a phone number so that the editor of the editorial page or an assistant could get back to this person and verify, yes, I wrote this letter and I do live on this street, and then they would run the letter, usually with the name and the name of the writer's town, and any further identification if necessary, the former mayor or whatever. That's not done on the websites, and I find that I'm very concerned about that, because people can say anything and hide behind anonymity, and many of these comments are really vicious and irresponsible, and I think they should require the name and location of these commentators, just as letters published in the newspaper have the name and the community of the letter writers there. That's really a bad move.
Scully, what do you do on your blog, the blog, The Hanging Shed?
I think the professor is absolutely right in that negative Ned from Naugatuck can get on any website he wants and write, this person's an idiot, he's a crook, et cetera, et cetera. It's a wild west out there. But that's on the people that operate the website. Take the time to only let thoughtful, both sides of the issue come through. On my particular blog, a friend of mine, when I started it, said to me, you know, those websites and blogs, you got to put up everything people say. Actually, there's a little button that you can hit that deletes the unrespectful, disrespectful comments that people want to make. If I had the time, I would do just what the professor says. Get the person's name and number on a secure part of the website, call them and ask them. In the meantime, I let on my site thoughtful, critical comments of what I have to say, what have you, but nowhere will you find ad hominem attacks or anything of that nature.
Rich?
I think I'll just offer a dissent. I think the internet offers, in its engineering, and intimacy, a chance, a self-correcting mechanism. That's the whole point of the internet, is that it's self-correcting. In terms of the engineering, if a server goes down, you can route it to another server. The same sort of pathway holds for political commentary. That is, people can write nasty things, but other people can respond to those nasty things the way they wish in the same space. And what happens over time on a given site is that people who constantly write nasty things are shunned or are criticized by others. So inherent in the comment field is a self-correcting mechanism that doesn't exist in newspapers, because it's printed and it's vetted and choices are made about who can comment and about what. Online you could comment about anything, but anyone can come back and comment on that. And over time, if someone gets a reputation among the community of being vicious, of being nasty, they will be shunned, or they'll be said, oh, there he goes again, or their reputation on a given site will be damaged. So I have no problem whatsoever with keeping it open to everybody. I think the more voices, the better. And any attempt to stifle the give and take, no matter how nasty, I think will lead to a very sterile clinical environment, which I contend is part of the reason why newspapers started falling out of favor. It became almost too clinical, too sterile in terms of what they published, too objective in the sense they weren't calling people out on what they were saying as factual or not. They were just merely saying,
responsible.
No, I don't believe that. No, I think if somebody says something and they say, well, we have to print it because they said it, that's irresponsible, but I think they should be called out on it.
So aren't we involved in a race to the bottom then?
Oh, yeah.
One person says nasty, no, you're an idiot, no, you're an idiot. And you can't weed it out by reputation because negative Ned can be troublesome from Trumbull the next time.
Well, well, you live with it. That's the internet. That's the environment you're in, and you hit it where it lies. I just find it to be actually, we're right now, why is this nation so politically vibrant? Whether you like, whatever side you're on. Why is it so politically vibrant? Well, it's because of this. To me, the danger exists in the fact if we only go to sites, this is what Paul said, that we believe, that reflects our opinion. What that does is that deletes that vibrancy because we're only reading stuff that appeals to us. And so you have hardened silos. And so the attempt at discourse, which as Habermas would say would be the communicative reason, is how you reach consensus, how you come to decisions, will be forever gone because we'll just be in these hardened silos of thought and opinion.
Rich, I'm going to cut you off for a minute because we have questions from the audience, starting right here.
Thank you all for being here. And I guess my question has to do with the way the blogs or the online articles and the comments that follow them take on a life of their own to the individual user. And I think that just goes a step probably further into the me media that Dr. Janish was talking about. In terms of, for example, the 2008 election, anybody that had a viewpoint whether they copied it out of a more liberal blog, a more conservative blog, is going to send it to everybody in their email list. And I'm sure that all of us, regardless of our political beliefs, received a lot of unwanted stuff where people said, this is it. Barack Obama was not born in the United States. The birther movement, people that gave birth to the Tea Party movement. My fear, and I'm curious to any of your viewpoints on this, is how by advent of their own ability through Wikipedia or just simply their own email list of the, I want to say, less educated general public, and risk being called elitist for saying so, but to me this is really where the birth of the Tea Partiers comes from. And people saying we want to believe this part and we want to make everybody else believe it too.
Well, I seem to think that I take your point well, and I agree with Professor Hanley in that we don't want to get into a situation where we're stifling viewpoints, but I do think you can police your own house and stop the ad hominem attacks, etc. I think the rise of the Tea Party through the internet is a good thing. I don't necessarily agree with all the views, but I think it's a very good thing. The birther movement, I think questioning and putting things in the public square is a very, very positive move. But you do get into situations where things are thrown around and take on a life of their own. But I do think that is the downfall of the internet. And I will say this, in my view, the decline of the newspaper is not unlike the decline of the post office. Why are they in trouble? Because there's email, there's fax, there's everything else. It's technology. Why is newspaper declining? Because the internet's more immediate, it's easier to use to get your news. But I do think the accountability is needed.
We had a question right here. I'm going to ask you to keep the questions short because we may not be picking them up on camera, so I'll repeat them. So go ahead, please.
We've been focused specifically on politics. Beyond that, to what extent has this age of reality media and reality America influenced what we're talking about today?
Interesting.
That's
Rich?
that's a terrific question that I don't think at this point we can answer. Last night I was on a panel about producing documentaries, and they're talking about reality TV and how it's not really reality, it's produced reality. I think we're still waiting to see how that influences discourse. We don't know. Because we've gone, I mean, even in the political area, we've gone from characters to caricatures. That is, the right caricatures the left caricatures the right. And so there's a very distant relationship to reality that we see reflected in a wider popular culture sphere, but it's called reality. So it's. I think that's a great question that is going to take time to resolve.
I think you probably see that type of thing weed out. You couldn't get me to watch the Jersey Shore at gunpoint, but one of my favorite shows is what Most America is. But it'll rise eventually. My favorite show is Whale Wars, which is an environmental show, and not very many people know about it. So I think you're going to get your balance of each, and I think Professor Hanley's right.
I want to get to a point that Professor Janish made when he was talking about politicians through history who went either through the media or around the media, because I think there are other new ways of approaching it now. And to me, some of the campaigns we're seeing this year are perfect examples of it. For instance, Linda McMahon. She spent so much money on not only television commercials, but on other expensive uses of media, such as very expensive and glossy mailers, that she was really able to establish herself, I think, without having to really address what we consider the traditional media from the get-go until much further along in her campaign.
Well, that's a good point, and it didn't start with Linda McMahon.
Sure.
And we've had this phenomenon in other states and even to a certain extent on the national stage, where a candidate with a lot of money can ignore what they call free media because they don't pay for news coverage, and pay for media, as you mentioned, to get their message across. I don't know if that's if that's a long-term solution for candidates who feel that the media are against them. There aren't many people who can spend as much money as Linda McMahon to run in a race in one of the smallest states in the union.
Well, Rich,
and nationally, it would cost billions to do what she's doing on a statewide basis. So it's interesting. It's happened before. It'll happen in the future. It'd be tough to be elected president that way.
Rich, you mentioned, though, that there are other types of media that are not so expensive, low-cost alternatives to what we call free media, which is generally considered newspaper, television, radio.
Sure, but just the social networking applications like Facebook and Twitter, where you can go directly to your base. And you can go directly to your base at minimal cost. I mean, it's really a staff member or a team of staff people tweeting on Twitter or posting status updates on Facebook, where you can galvanize enormous support and reach directly into their home, into their space, into their screen, or into their cell phone with your message of the moment. And it's like the way political campaigns are now. If a candidate says something, the opposition can immediately tap into this enormous network of supporters through these free applications, and then maybe post a free ad on YouTube, a free video on YouTube, and just hit back. So the whole process of discourse has accelerated. I think that, to Paul's point, that may not be a good thing, and that it becomes, a constant collision of ideas, and there's no one stepping back vetting it. And this is where I think traditional media come in. Media need to cover these sort of applications and vet it for accuracy and report on what's being said.
Pat, you have a lot of experience politically. How would you deal with it if you were in the role that you used to have as the spokesperson for the Democratic Senate, Democrats in the Senate? What would you do if, in the age of tweeting and blogging?
You absolutely have to be all over the social media. And as Rich said, it doesn't cost much. And I can tell you from personal experience that every single day when I read my Facebook account, I know where Dan Malloy is. I know where Linda McMahon is. I know where Dick Blumenthal is. I mean, physically. I'm at the Durham Town Fair, and it's great to see these people, 3 or 4 different pictures. So we tried to move. We were actually archaic when I started there as far as websites and interactivity and social media, and now they've caught up and then some. It's an important tool for sure.
Because I'm thinking these days you wouldn't have to call me at 4:30 in the morning, although we were emailing, so that was okay for that time.
Never yelling.
One of the things that some of the candidates have complained about, and this was a comment that Peter Schiff made, who was a candidate for senator, he said that he couldn't get any coverage from the traditional media. And we've had, at CTN, we've had some of the third-party candidates who we are very careful about trying to give equal coverage to say, I can't get in the media. Pat, is their issue legitimate, and what do you do about that?
It's a legitimate issue, but you also have to look at it from the media's viewpoint. If I run Channel 3, if I run Fox 61, I want the main 2 candidates for governor. It may be unfortunate, but that, in reality, though one of those 2 is going to be our next governor. Those are the people I want to see. It would be nice if we had so many forums that anybody that has their name on the ballot can get up there, but I respect the news director's right to say, look, we have to limit it because of our limited time. It's probably not a very popular viewpoint, especially among the guys that don't get on. But I think that you really do have to pick your spots when you have such limited time. And it is a bit unfortunate that Tom Marsh, who's running for governor, or Peter Schiff, U.S. Senate, didn't get into the mainstream media, but there's a reason for that. They don't have the support that the other that the others do, and maybe they would get more support if they do. You know, it's a chicken and the egg thing.
So then, Rich, how does a third-party candidate build a base?
You can mount an insurgency at low cost online, and that your message would percolate, you know, through the ecosphere of the internet to the mainstream media, and you would get coverage. And you could do it, you know, just by constantly hammering Twitter and Facebook updates, you know, making sure your constituency is also using your message to talk to their friends online. So it's, I mean, the viral marketing does work when done properly, and if there is a message associated with it that has some strength. And third-party candidates can do this without blaming the mainstream media for their problems.
We're kind of blurring a distinction here between a candidate getting the message out and the news media covering candidates. Mm-hmm. And let me talk about the second of those. Without exception, every market in the country, including the markets in Connecticut, have fewer reporters on the ground covering day-to-day news, whether it's politics or education or city hall or fires or police or whatever. And that's because of the problem newspapers are having. Even people in television and radio who have done their research will acknowledge that 85% of all original reporting, even in the age of the internet, 85% is done by newspapers. And by original reporting, I don't mean covering a baseball game or a press conference, but I don't mean investigative reporting necessarily either, but just getting beyond the headline. Why did the school board raise taxes? What is this problem at City Hall? Is the police department guilty of corruption or of ganging up on minorities or whatever? That reporting comes from newspapers, and what television does on the local basis, local stations, they go back and cover it with video. And what happens on the national level, same thing. If you want to see what's going to be on ABC, NBC, and CBS at 6:30 that night, or PBS for that matter, read the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post, because they go back and make movies of what was in the newspaper. And this is what concerns me about the decline of newspapers. I don't care about ink on paper and delivering a product to the driveway. I care about journalism and however it's delivered. And I care about the fact that there are fewer reporters on the ground covering the news, and we're leaving it to the people, to the advocates, and to the people who have an axe to grind, rather than to people who are at least in theory objective.
Well, I would like to make another point, because we have a journalist in the room who is a proprietor and founder of a hyper-local news site, and I would say that the hyper-local news sites that are online are making up for some of that, because I know that Anna Sava's site, well, Anna Sava's in the back of the room, I know that her site will cover the West Hartford School Board meeting. I know that they'll cover zoning board meetings. I know that they're going to give me the intimate, in-depth detail that I no longer get from my newspaper.
Well, it's interesting. All the innovation and startup activity in journalism, 90% of it, is with local news. With company, Patch, which is now owned by AOL.
Online.
Yeah, online news, yeah, because they don't have the sunk cost of a press. Right. But, you know, sites like Patch.com, which is now arriving in Connecticut and spreading throughout, you know, the suburban areas here, Main Street Connect.us, just to name two. The innovation is happening at local news, because I think even investors recognize that the main gap in coverage is what Paul identified. It's covering the local school stuff, covering your local cop shop. And that to the investor is, well, if people are interested in local news, then local advertisers will be interested. So I think there's some repair work going on here online with a lot of investment in hyperlocal news.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to see if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Separate the quality of the news from the editorial position. Example, New York Times versus Wall Street Journal. I have a friend that's very liberal. He reads the Wall Street Journal. He says, I don't read the editorials. I'm a conservative. I read the New York Times, but I don't like the editorials. So the question I'm really asking is, does the quality of the news and independence depend on the editorial position? I don't want to slant it. In other words, I'm a conservative. I read the New York Times quality of information. My friend recommends the Wall Street Journal. He says they're fantastic in reporting the news.
There is a separation. There's supposed to be a separation. And there is for the most part. And anybody who looks at newspapers carefully can identify a particular story or a particular reporter for that matter, who seems to be leaning the way the editorial page leans, but that's the exception. When I was a reporter and when I was an editor, and I was always in news, we prided ourselves on not taking orders directly or indirectly from the editorial page, and we often worked on stories that were unflattering to people or causes that were endorsed by the editorial page. So again, there are lapses, but I think generally all middle-sized and large newspapers honor that separation between church and state.
I certainly would agree with that, but I think, sir, if you're a conservative, then, for instance, the Waterbury Republican American would be right up your alley. I mean, there's editorially, they're so far right, they're off the charts. But Kevin Sullivan, used to be the Senate president, and I was his communications director, used to tell me that if he ever found a cure for cancer, the headline would be, "Millions die before Sullivan finds cure." So there are instances of it crossing over, but the Republican Americans, reporters that I know, are right down the middle, the fairest journalists that you could find.
Now, an exception to what I said, and this is an exception to almost every rule of good journalism, is the New York Post, which is so untypical of newspapers in this country. It's very much like a British newspaper, and that's no surprise because Rupert Murdoch was an Australian who then made his fortune in Great Britain. He's now an American citizen. But that's a British newspaper. That's a British-style newspaper, which has a point of view that's through all of the pages. It's not just the editorial page. That's the way it is in other countries, particularly in the UK. So that's an exception, but that's not typical.
I would say, in answer to your question also, that I think sometimes, although a reporter may not be biased, the choice of what goes in the newspaper, even if it's not directly reflected, even if the editorial page people have a firewall between themselves and the newsroom, I think that the choice of what goes on the front page, or the choice of whether you go to this or you cover this or you cover that, does reflect in great deal not only what the paper's point of view is, but maybe even more so what the paper's business philosophy is and how to get more readers. And that's not just newspapers, it's the television stations and the radio stations too. You know, if a TV station knows that people are going to be really interested in seeing a particular story, or they think it will chart well in their ratings, they may cover that over a story that's much more important. Because when I say more important in terms of affecting more lives, because the other story is sexier or what have you, and it'll get people's attention. We have time for one more question before we close. Yes?
I'll address this question. Professors of journalism, is there a newspaper journalism school in the new social media where anyone, John Public, can go and report a story and then they say, well, I'm not a reporter, I didn't go to journalism school?
Well, that's a good question because we have two people from a journalism school here, so let's see what they say.
I'll go first. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's like, what would you rather watch? Would you rather a beer softball game or the Yankees? Okay. Well, the Giants or the Jets? No. It's very important that journalism retain its professional and thoughtful approach. And that requires trained journalists who know that the principles of objectivity are honorable principles and are timeless in the sense that in order to better serve the public, you have to serve the public objectively and be balanced and fair, seriously in your reportage, but also to know the mechanics of how to get into a government database and ferret through that government database and to detect patterns of corruption. There's a Allentown, I think, Pennsylvania newspaper over the last week has done a series of stories which they've identified 20 people who have long-standing relations with government. They're private citizens, but they continually get contracts. That is because a reporter trained in the techniques that, like we teach, like computer-assisted reporting, understood how to get into a database, examine that information, query that information. So at a high level, we teach students how to find within that data information that can affect the public. And I don't think just an ordinary person has the skill set to query a database or the time to do so at this level. So journalism schools are extraordinarily important.
I think there's room for both. I agree with Rich. Any sensitive story, any story that requires digging, that requires training, I think professional journalists should be doing that. But there's room for personal journalism, citizen journalism, about neighborhoods, about clubs, about cultural activities, and so on. And so I like professional journalism, and I've been speaking in its defense. But I think there's room for citizen journalism too. But I want the person named.
Yeah.
And Pat, I'll give you the last word.
Well, my parents would kill me if I didn't point out they spent nearly $100,000 sending me to journalism school. So I think I agree for the most part. I am very, at times, frightened of citizen journalists for just the reason these folks say. There is, in fact, a place for them. But if you're not properly trained, then you run into all sorts of problems, many of which we've discussed here. I think these folks are the ones that have their thumb on the pulse of each particular town. But I also think it is very, very important for the people to do these jobs, be trained in them, just like any other profession.
Well, thank you all three for being with us. I appreciate it. Paul Janish, Rich Hanley, Pat Scully, thank you all for spending your lunchtime with us. We hope we'll see you soon.
Thank you to everybody, to our speaker, our panelists, to Diane, and to you, our audience. We hope to see you again, and we hope you go off today and start a lot of good conversations about the food for thought that we had today. Thank you very much.